Hey everyone, so since we found ourselves suddenly needing to use this medium of videos and YouTube for our messages and reflections in OIC, I wanted to take advantage of that. And I guess one advantage of not being restricted to when we meet in person is that we can share more and keep our reflection going throughout the week. Because there's more actually that I wanted to say on Sunday and we couldn't really fit it in that time. But I get to share it now. And there's one thing in particular that I wanted to say and that stuck with me since, and this is it. It matters that Jesus chose a Samaritan as an example. If you haven't checked the message from last Sunday, you'll probably get a lot more from what I'm saying now. If you check that first, you'll find it right there with this one in our YouTube channel. And yeah, you can check that if you want first. I talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 and how Jesus tells the parable in response to an expert in law who's trying to sort of work his way out of what we often call the Great Commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your strength, with all your mind, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. But who's my neighbor? This guy asks, and Jesus replies with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the way Jesus tells the parable leaves room for this guy who asked him to place himself in one of two different roles. He can understand himself as one of these self-righteous persons who bypass this other man who is badly hurt, half dead on the side of the road, and they sort of avoid him and walk around him. And in that case, the parable can be understood to be a critique to self-righteousness and to religious hypocrisy. But there's also room for him to understand himself as the man who is beaten and left half dead at the side of the road, the one needing help. And in that case, the parable can be understood to be an invitation to compassion, to understand oneself in the place of the other. And I argue that I think it's on purpose that there's room for these two interpretations, because it's not an either or, but in both and. We're supposed to see them both, because to love and to be loved are profoundly interconnected. To be a neighbor of and a neighbor to are profoundly interconnected. We are always self and other at the same time. And in fact, as Christians, we sort of go even beyond or behind that, and we say that we love because God loved us first. So our loving is always a response, even when it is an act. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. You are loved and you love. But here's the thing. All of this would make sense still if Jesus had used just any average Joe to be the one who stops and helps, the one who loves. But he didn't. He chose a Samaritan, and that's important. So much so that to this day, this is known as the parable of the Good Samaritan. Not the parable of the good guy who helped, but the parable of the Good Samaritan, because Jesus makes a point out of saying that he's a Samaritan. And why is that? And here's what I think. I think it's because he wouldn't allow this expert in the law, and he won't allow us to set our limits, our borders on where love and kindness end. If he had used just an average Jew, hypocrisy and self-righteousness would sort of do their thing again. And we would find arguments like, what this means is that we cannot make exception within the Jewish community. So everyone is everyone's neighbor and needs to love each other within these boundaries. But we do find that kind of argument, don't we? Love your neighbor as yourself within the Jewish community. Love your neighbor as yourself within the Christian community. Love your neighbor as yourself within the white community. Love your neighbor as yourself within the European, within the Western community. Love your neighbor as yourself within these boundaries of ethnicity, culture, skin color, gender, and so on and so forth. But that's not what Jesus was aiming at. It was a Samaritan. And the Samaritans were a stereotypical other for the first century Jew. And it was a Samaritan who helped and loved and so in spirit and in truth actually fulfilled the law. So the point is, we don't get to set up our boundaries on whom we are supposed to love and whom it's somehow okay not to. That's not the call of the gospel. The call of the gospel is to love your neighbor as yourself. And it's not an easy call. but it's a good one, and it's a necessary one to keep in mind, in heart, in prayer, and in practice these days. This is a time when borders are closing for health reasons, and that might be a proper move. I mean, epidemiology and public health aren't my areas. But what we can't do is close our personal borders. Love for country and for people and a misguided love for self are very easily hijacked by hatred and exclusion and distrust. But we need to be people who remember that Jesus told us about the Good Samaritan. We need to be people who love because God loved us first, people who allow ourselves to be loved by the Samaritan neighbor and who dare to love our neighbor as ourselves, whomever that neighbor may be. That's what I wanted to share with you today. Stay in peace in these challenging times, and know that Christ is with you.